On that rainy night, I was completely alone at home. The storm outside seemed endless, with thunder that made the windows shake and the rain hitting the roof hard. I had prepared a cup of tea and was trying to distract myself with the TV when the landline in the living room started ringing. I found it strange because no one used to call me on that old line, but I let the sound echo a few seconds before answering. When I finally put the phone in my ear, I only heard static. At first, I thought it was some problem on the line, common on rainy days. But before hanging up, I noticed something different, a slight breathing sound. It wasn't just any hiss. It was rhythmic, heavy, as if someone was listening and had no intention of speaking. My heart accelerated immediately, and I hung up hard. I went back to the couch trying to convince myself that it was just the interference of the storm, even though deep down I knew it sounded too human. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. I froze, looking at the device as if it were a threat. I let the ring repeat itself several times until I had the courage to answer. Again, static, and soon after, the same breath. Only this time, it seemed closer, sharper, as if the person had gotten even closer to the microphone. I hung up faster, feeling my hands tremble. This time, the feeling of being watched took over me. I decided not to give it any more importance and unplugged the device from the outlet. But the tension was already inside me. I went upstairs to get a blanket in the room, trying to calm down. That's when I heard something that paralyzed me. The same phone ringing, echoing down the corridor. Loud, of course, insistent, but there was no phone upstairs. I knew every corner of the house, and there was only that old fixed one in the living room. That sound reverberated from one of the rooms, as if someone had put a hidden device there. I ran to the guest room, where it seemed to come from, but when I opened the door, all I found was the bed made and the curtains moving with the wind. The ring stopped immediately, leaving only the noise of the rain hitting against the window. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't take another step into the room. I returned to the corridor with my heart racing, and at that moment, I noticed another detail. The door to my room was ajar. I was absolutely sure that I had left it closed. Slowly, I walked there and pushed the door. Everything was apparently in place, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I stood there, listening only to the sound of thunder in the background, until I created the courage to check every corner. Nothing. I went downstairs as fast as I could, and locked myself in the living room with all the lights on. Still, the feeling of not being alone didn't leave me. I looked at the disconnected phone, motionless, and my heart almost came out of my mouth when I heard the ringtone echo again, this time coming clearly from the kitchen. I knew there was no other device there, but the sound was so real that it seemed impossible to ignore. With panting breath, I walked to the kitchen and turned on the light. The sound stopped at the same time, leaving only the constant dripping of water that came from somewhere in the sink. I looked for everything, but I couldn't find anything that justified that touch. The floor was wet from so much rain that I had taken it myself when entering and leaving the rooms. But other than that, nothing. Still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching me in the dark, hidden in some corner that I couldn't see. I went back to the living room and decided to turn on the TV very loudly to try to distract myself. But it was useless. Throughout the night, I felt as if at any moment that ring would sound again, coming from somewhere in the house. I stayed awake until the sun rose, not daring to turn off any lamp. Every shadow, every noise of the storm seemed to carry an invisible threat. The next morning, with the light coming in through the windows, everything seemed normal again. I went to the phone in the living room, and it was exactly as I had left it, unplugged. No signal of incoming call. No history, no explanation. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew I had heard. And that wasn't a dream, it wasn't imagination. I spent the following days avoiding being alone at home during the night. Whenever the weather forecast announced a storm, I made up some excuse to sleep outside. The fear of hearing that touch echoing again, coming from where it shouldn't, was greater than any rationalization I tried to do. Until today, I've never heard anything again, but the memory of that night haunts me. What torments me the most is knowing that the breathing was real. Too clear to be a line defect. Someone was on the other side, listening. And someone somehow made the phone ring where there was no phone. To this day I can't explain, and I wonder, if I were you that night, would you have answered again? Story 2. I always had the habit of coming home late from work, especially on rainy nights, when the traffic dragged on and everything seemed to take longer. That specific night, I got home around 11, tired and just wanting a hot shower. When I parked in front of the house, I noticed something that immediately put me on alert. There was a car parked across the street, with the headlights off. It was not common to see cars stowed there, even more so at that time. At first, I tried to rationalize, thinking that maybe it was just someone waiting for someone or even with mechanical problems. But there was something strange about the vehicle's immobility. The car was completely off, no internal light, no visible movement. I sat inside my own car for a few seconds, watching. The rain fell heavily on the windshield, and it gave me the feeling that I was hidden, but at the same time exposed. I took a deep breath, went down and quickly entered the house. With every step I took towards the door, I felt like I was being watched, even without being able to see anyone inside the vehicle. I locked the door hard and tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. For a while, I even managed to distract myself. I put the kettle on the fire, prepared a tea, and turned on the TV to drown out the noise of the storm. But curiosity ate at me. I took the curtain from the living room and opened it slightly just to check. The car was still there, at the exact same point, motionless, with the water dripping down the ceiling and reflecting the low light from the poles. My stomach turned. No one left. Nothing happened. It was as if the car was waiting. I let it go by for almost an hour, trying to concentrate on anything else. But every time I looked out the window, that scene remained the same. The car looked like a black hole in the middle of the street, a fixed point that could not be explained. I began to imagine 1,000 possibilities. What if it was someone waiting for me? What if it was a neighbor watching? Or worse, a stranger watching my every move inside the house? The feeling was suffocating. After almost 2 hours, the rain gave no respite, and the car remained in the same place. I took my cell phone and sent a message to a friend, commenting on what was happening. He replied laughing, saying that I was getting paranoid, but also suggested that I call the police, just to be sure. The simple act of typing to ask for help already made me feel a momentary relief, but it also increased the tension, as if I was admitting that there was really danger. So I decided to call the police. I explained the situation calmly, but I didn't hide my concern. On the other end of the line, the attendant said he would send a car to take a look. While waiting, I couldn't take my eyes off the window. The car was still there, without any movement, and the rain made it difficult to distinguish details from the interior. I barely blinked, as if any blink was the chance to miss an important detail. About 15 minutes later, I saw the lights of the vehicle reflecting on the street. I went out to the door, feeling a little safer just seeing the police coming. But what happened next made me even more disturbed. When I looked at the street again, the car had disappeared. There was no brand of fresh tires, only the soaked and empty asphalt. It was as if I had never been there. I ran to the balcony to try to find any sign of the vehicle, but there was nothing. The police arrived, went around the street with the flashlight, but found nothing suspicious. They asked if I was sure of what I had seen. I confirmed firmly, but at the same time I felt stupid. How could you explain that the car was stopped for hours and simply disappeared the moment the police showed up? I spent the rest of the night without being able to sleep properly. Every time the wind shook the window, I thought the car was back, parked in the same position, with someone watching me from inside. I kept lifting the curtain from time to time, checking, but the street remained empty until dawn. The silence after the storm only made the experience stranger, as if everything had been a nightmare. The next day, with the sunlight, I tried to analyze the street in search of any tire mark, but there was nothing but wet leaves scattered on the asphalt. I asked some neighbors if they had seen anything the night before, but they all denied it. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was as if I was the only one to have witnessed that enigmatic presence. During the following days, the memory didn't leave my head. Every time I parked at night, I felt the need to check more than once if there were no cars stopped nearby. Paranoia began to be part of my routine, and every lighthouse that went out seemed to hide someone in there. I never felt completely calm again when I came home late. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The car was really there, stopped, motionless, hours in a row in the rain. But it disappeared the moment it could have been identified. That was what disturbed me the most. If it was just someone waiting, why disappear so quickly? What if it wasn't a coincidence? Was anyone really watching me that night? And if it were up to you, would you have the courage to stare through the window until the end, or would you have run out of the house? Story 3. I've always considered my dog the best alarm I could have at home. He wasn't the type to bark for nothing, so when that rainy dawn he started barking nonstop in the backyard, something inside me already knew there was something wrong. I looked at the clock, and it was just after 2 in the morning. The rain hit hard on the windows, and the sound of barking mixed with the noise of the storm, creating a suffocating climate. I got out of bed with my heart racing, trying to convince myself that it could be just any animal passing by. I went to the kitchen and turned on the light that gave the backyard. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but the dog didn't stop, growling in a way I had rarely seen before. I took courage and opened the curtain of the glass door. That's when I realized something that made me freeze completely. There were soaked footprints scattered all over the grass. They weren't random marks, they were clear, sharp steps of someone barefoot or wearing thin shoes, walking through my backyard in the middle of that rain. The marks started near the broken fence, which I already knew I needed to fix, but which I always ended up putting off. From there, they went to the back door of the house. The detail that left me breathless was realizing that the footprints did not stop at the door. They returned, in the same direction where they had come, to the fence. Someone had walked to my house, stopped in front of the door, and then returned by the same way. All this while I slept, without imagining what was happening outside. My first instinct was to check if the door was well locked. I turned the handle with my hands shaking, and luckily it was closed. But the idea that someone had come so close, in the middle of the rain, left my stomach wrapped. I looked through the curtain again, trying to see something beyond the marks, but the darkness of the backyard was only cut by the occasional lightning, which illuminated the lawn for fractions of a second. The dog was still agitated, running from one side to the other, as if waiting for that person to come back. I knew I needed to do something, but I was paralyzed. I thought about calling the police, but how to explain? I found footprints in the backyard during the rain. At this point, they could have already disappeared with the water that kept falling. The feeling of vulnerability was huge, as if my house, my safe space, had been invaded without anyone having actually entered. After a few minutes standing in the kitchen, I decided to open a crack in the door just to call the dog inside. He ran in, wet and still growling low. I closed it quickly and stopped again, feeling a momentary relief. But when I looked again through the curtain, I realized that some of the footprints seemed too fresh, as if they hadn't been made much earlier. This made me even more nervous, because it meant that that person had passed by just before I turned on the light. I decided to turn off all the lights and be silent, watching. The rain continued, and for long minutes nothing happened but the constant sound of falling water. But at a certain moment, I swear I heard a snap coming from the fence. I don't know if it was the wind, a branch or something else, but my whole body was on alert. The dog raised his head and stared in the same direction, confirming that it was not just my imagination. I took my cell phone and started filming through the window, without the courage to leave. The camera barely captured something because of the darkness, but I needed to record somehow. My fear was that that person intended to return. The most disturbing thing was to think that, if it weren't for the dog, maybe I would never have found out that someone was hanging around the house that night. I would be sleeping, completely exposed. Time didn't seem to pass. I sat in the kitchen for almost an hour, staring at the backyard, without taking my eyes off. With each lightning, my heart raced, waiting to see something move on the lawn. Fortunately, I didn't see anyone, but the doubt if that person was still around was unbearable. When I finally got up the courage to open the back door in the morning, the scene made me even more confused. The rain had erased most of the marks, but some footprints were still visible near the fence. And there, right next to it, there seemed to be a mark of something that had been supported on the ground, as if it were a backpack or a heavy bag. This made me think that the person was not just passing by, but maybe waiting for something. I spent the whole day trying to find rational explanations. Could it be a drunken neighbor, someone cutting the way through the rain? But nothing explained why to stop in front of the door, look in silence, and then simply go back. In addition, no one would have a reason to cross a private backyard in the middle of the night. The feeling of invasion was stronger than any excuse I could make up. In the following days, the dog continued to act strange, especially at night. He was lying near the back door, as if he expected something. One morning, it even barked again, but when I got up, I didn't see anything. This only reinforced the idea that there was someone hanging around. To this day, I remember the sound of the rain current mixed with the barking, and the cold in my stomach when I saw those wet footprints leading to my door. I never knew who did it or why. All I know is that if it weren't for the habit of always keeping the doors locked, maybe the story would have ended in a much worse way. And I wonder, What would you do if you woke up in the middle of the night and found that someone walked to your door, looked inside your house, and then simply returned to the darkness? Story 4. I stayed a few days at a friend's house in Vermont, in a remote region surrounded by trees. It was early November, and the nights were getting colder, especially when it rained. That specific night, a heavy storm fell, and thunder echoed throughout the valley. I was alone in the guest room, fiddling with my cell phone to try to fall asleep, when I decided to look out the window just out of curiosity. It was at that moment that I realized something that made me restless immediately. The window of the neighboring house, which had been empty for years, was lit. I knew the history of the house. The owner had died, and the heirs never decided what to do with the place. Whenever we passed by, it seemed completely abandoned, with the garden taken over by the tall tude, and the windows always dark. At first, I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the reflection of lightning, I thought. But I kept looking and realized it wasn't. The light remained constant, yellowish, as if it were from an old lamp. And then, something made my stomach sink. I clearly saw a shadow moving from one side to the other inside the room. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't imagination. Someone was inside, in what should be an abandoned house. Every second I was watching, more details seemed to confirm that it was not a mistake of my eyes. The shadow stopped, then walked, as if it were looking through the window itself. My heart raced, and I felt a strong urge to call my friend, but at the same time I didn't want to look paranoid. I decided to move away from the window and try to ignore it, but curiosity and fear together were stronger. I took my cell phone and even opened the camera, pointing in the direction of the neighboring house. The screen showed only blurs, the storm made everything difficult, but the light was still visible. I recorded a few seconds, trying to record, but it seemed that the shadow disappeared every time I tried to focus. It was as if I was aware that I was being watched. I went back to bed and stayed there, motionless, trying to think of something else. But shortly after, I felt an irresistible urge to look again. I got up slowly and opened the curtain just a little. This time, the light was off. The house was completely dark, as it always should be. The detail that made me most uncomfortable was that it seemed that the window was now open, when it was closed before. The thin curtain moved with the wind, and I couldn't understand how that had happened. I spent the rest of the night almost without sleeping, listening to the rain and every snap of the wood in the house, as if it were an alert. My friend didn't wake up at any time, and I didn't have the courage to knock on his door to tell him. I just stared at the ceiling, wondering if someone could have left the neighboring house and walked there. My mind didn't stop creating scenarios, each one worse than the other. The next morning, when the sun finally came out and the storm stopped, I ran to look out the window again. The house was there, as always, dirty with the paint peeling, the bush taking over, dusty and closed windows. No sign of life. If someone had been there the night before, they had not left any visible trace. But the image of the light on and the shadow walking was still engraved in my memory. I commented with my friend at breakfast. He just laughed and said that I had probably confused it with the brightness of lightning. But when I insisted that I saw a shadow, he got serious and said something that only increased my anguish. "You're not the first person to say that. Some neighbors have sworn that they saw lights inside too." The calm way he said that only made the situation stranger, as if it were something normal, but for me there was nothing normal. During the day, I considered the idea of going there, but just thinking about entering that abandoned house, my whole body reacted with terror. There was no reason for me to take a risk, and at the same time, I felt I needed an answer. It was as if the mystery had taken root in my mind, forcing me to think about what I had seen. Still, I didn't take courage. The next night, I confess that I became obsessed. Even before the storm returned, I positioned myself near the window hoping to see something. And for hours, nothing happened. Until shortly after 2 in the morning, a flash lit up the sky. For a fraction of a second, I had the impression of seeing the same window open again. But this time there was no light. Just a darkness that seemed even more threatening than the shadow vision of the previous night. The following days were quiet, but the memory of that night didn't leave my head. Whenever he passed near the house, he looked up, hoping to see some movement. I never saw the light on again, but the feeling of being watched remained. It was as if, when I noticed the presence of that once, I had opened a door that I could no longer close. To this day, whenever it rains hard and the energy flashes, I remember that illuminated window in Vermont. I could never explain what I saw, and even if there was a simple explanation, it doesn't change the fact that I swear I saw someone move inside that abandoned house. And this is something that still haunts me. Who was there that night and why? Story 5. On that rainy night, I was completely alone at home. The storm hit hard against the roof, and the sound of water running down the gutters was constant. I like to hear rain, it usually calms me down, but that night there was something different. Maybe it was the heavy darkness, or the fact that the energy had already fluctuated a few times. I was lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, when I heard a sound that didn't match the rest. 3 light knocks on the front door. At first, I thought I had imagined. Sometimes, the branches of the trees hit the balcony with the strong wind, creating strange sounds. I was silent, trying to convince myself that it was. But less than a minute later, new knocks came, this time a little stronger, cadenced, as if someone had really used their knuckles against the wood of the door. My heart accelerated, and I got up slowly. I walked to the corridor, and with each step the sound of the rain seemed to get louder, muffling everything. I held my breath when I got close to the door, with the strange feeling that something was watching me on the other side. I didn't want to open it, obviously, but my curiosity won. I lifted the curtain from the side window just enough to peek. That's when I saw a soaked man was standing right on the porch, less than a meter from the door. He didn't have an umbrella, he didn't seem to have any coat suitable for the rain, just ordinary clothes, soaked and glued to the body. The most disturbing detail, however, was the face. He didn't seem angry, he didn't seem to ask for help, he didn't even speak. I was just smiling. A frozen, strange smile that didn't match the situation of someone standing in the middle of a storm like that. My instincts screamed for me to call the police, but at the same time I didn't want to take my eyes off him. It seemed that if I moved away, I would lose control of the situation. I stood there, staring, with my hand shaking against the curtain. He didn't move, he just kept his gaze fixed, as if he had all the time in the world. The smile seemed to increase the more I looked. I decided to take the cell phone that was on the next table. Still holding the curtain with one hand, I stretched the other to reach the device. But when I looked again, he was no longer there. The porch was empty, and the rain kept falling as before. I felt dizzy for a few seconds, trying to understand how someone could have disappeared in silence so quickly. Very carefully, I looked better through the glass. What I saw made me even more confused. There were puddles of water scattered along the porch boards and the front stairs, as if someone had really been there for a long time. The marks were not before, and now they shone with lightning, slowly flowing into the lawn. He had really been there, it wasn't imagination. I closed the curtains immediately and walked away, trying to control my breathing. I sat on the couch, hugging the blanket tightly, and stood there motionless, listening to every noise in the house. My cell phone was in my hand, but I hesitated to call the police. What would I say? A soaked man smiled at me and disappeared. It seemed so absurd, but at the same time, the fear was real, physical. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every thunder made me jump, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that, if I looked out the window again, he would be there, standing exactly in the same place. The sound of the rain, which used to be almost relaxing, now seemed like a constant background for something that could happen at any time. When it finally dawned, I ran to the door to check. The porch was still damp, but the puddles had disappeared. The stairs, however, had different watermarks, as if bare feet had stepped there. It wasn't my impression that had really happened. I spent the whole day without being able to stop thinking about it, trying to find a logical explanation, but none of them made sense. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he appeared that way. I've never seen anything like it again, but whenever it rains hard, I feel the same fear going up my spine, as if at any moment he could come back and knock on the door again. And that's what scares me the most. Was he just passing by, or is he still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back? Story 6. I always leave the TV on when it's raining hard, because the constant noise of the storm usually makes me anxious. That night, the rain hit the windows hard, and the wind made the backyard trees creak. I sat on the sofa in the living room, trying to relax watching anything that happened. It was any program, one of those that you don't pay much attention to. You just leave it rolling so you don't feel alone. During a break, I stared at the dark television screen. That's when I realized something that made me freeze completely. In the reflection of the screen, behind the sofa where I was sitting, there seemed to be a standing silhouette. I blinked a few times, thinking it was the impression caused by the lightning lights, but the shape remained there. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, in absolute silence. My body locked. The feeling of vulnerability was immediate. I wanted to turn my head to check, but at the same time, I was afraid to confirm. The reflection showed no details, just a dark, human, motionless contour. The heart beat so fast that I could hear the blood in my ears. I created courage, took a deep breath, and finally turned around at once, hoping to see someone in the middle of the room. There was nothing. The sofa was leaning against the wall, and the room was empty, only illuminated by the occasional flashes of lightning. I stood for a few seconds, panting, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I noticed something that made the panic return immediately. The side window was open, and the rain flowed through the glass, forming a puddle on the carpet. That window I had closed earlier, I remember perfectly having checked it before lying down on the couch. The latch was difficult to lock, and I had made a point of turning it twice. Now it was wide open, beating with the wind, and the wet curtain stuck to the parapet. I ran to close it, but when I held the latch, I felt the cold of the water and realized that the marks on the carpet were not only rain. There were sharp footprints, as if someone had entered there. The air became heavy, and I felt that same strange pressure in my chest that we feel when we are being observed. I took a few steps back, trying to analyze the trail on the carpet. The footprints went from the window to the middle of the room, right behind the sofa where I was sitting, and then disappeared. There were no marks coming back. There was no continuity. It was as if the person had simply stopped there, exactly at the point where I had seen her reflected on TV. The logic didn't make sense. I kept spinning in circles in the room, trying to find some sign that someone had left. The door was locked from the inside, the other windows closed. The only place that gave access was that side window, but the footprints ended in the middle of the room, without moving forward. The idea that someone could still be inside the house, hidden, began to eat me inside. I took a flashlight and searched every room, opening doors with my trembling hand, looking under the beds, inside the bathroom, even in the clothes closet. Nothing. The house was completely empty. But the trail was still fresh on the carpet, and I couldn't forget the sharpness of the silhouette reflected on the television. It was impossible to ignore. It was impossible to rationalize. I went back to the living room and stared at the dark TV screen, without the courage to turn it off. With every lightning, my mind swore to see the shadow again, even without anyone there. The noise of the rain, which used to calm me down, now looked like a curtain that muffled any other sound, as if someone could walk around the house without me noticing. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, with all the lights on, waiting for dawn. The cell phone was in my hand, but I couldn't decide whether to call the police. I knew that, at most, they would find an open window and a wet carpet, nothing more than that. There was no explanation that made sense, only that disturbing emptiness that remained afterwards. When the day finally arrived, the trail on the carpet was still there, only weaker, as if it had begun to dry. I kept looking at those marks until they disappeared, wondering who, or what, had been behind me that night. Since then, I have never been able to watch television in a dark room, without feeling that someone could be reflected behind me. And the question that never leaves my head is, if I hadn't looked at the TV at that moment, would I have realized that I wasn't alone? Story 7. I remember that night as if it were yesterday. The rain was falling hard, hitting the windows of my room and muffling all the other sounds in the house. I always liked the sound of the rain, but that morning there was something different. The wind was violent, and suddenly, in the middle of all that noise, I began to hear a distinct sound, like heavy steps coming from the attic. At first, I thought it was just the wood creaking with the temperature change, but the more I paid attention, the more it looked like someone walking up there. I lay still, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but the sounds continued. They were rhythmic, paused, as if someone was really walking. What made me most nervous was remembering that the attic of my house had no access stairs. There was only a small door on the ceiling of the hallway, which had never been used since we moved. I had never seen anyone open that door. So, how could there be noise of footsteps inside? My heart began to speed up, and the first thing I thought of was sending a message to my mother, who slept in the next room. But I hesitated. What if it was just me imagining? What if it was really the wood cracking with the weight of the rain? I didn't want to look paranoid, so I stood still listening. Each step echoed as if something heavy moved from one side to the other, until it stopped exactly above my room. It was at that moment that fear really took over me. I covered myself with the sheet, as if it would protect me from something, and I held my breath so as not to make any sound. What made me even more terrified was hearing the noise suddenly stop, followed by a heavy silence. It was as if the thing up there knew I had noticed. Little by little, I gathered courage and got out of bed, even with my legs shaking. I walked to the hallway and looked at the ceiling. The attic door was there as always, but I swear it seemed a little out of place, as if it had been moved recently. A small crack of dust was scattered around the lid, as if it had been pushed from the inside out. I thought about looking for a ladder to check, but at the same time, something inside me screamed for me not to do that. I decided to go back to the room and lock the door, but I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard the heavy steps again, now faster, as if someone was running through the attic. The sound echoed right above me, stronger and stronger, until it suddenly stopped again. My whole body was goosebumps. I decided to turn on the TV in the room, not to watch, but just to have some sound beyond the storm and those steps. While trying to distract myself, I noticed by the reflection of the screen something that made my stomach freeze. Dust falling slowly from the slit of the attic door, as if it had just been stirred again. I went back to bed, but I couldn't lie down. I sat, hugging a pillow, staring at the ceiling and waiting for some movement. The rain was still heavy outside, but in some moments the noise of the steps came back, now more spaced, as if something was dragging, no longer walking. I couldn't find an explanation for that. I decided to send a message to a friend, just to distract myself, but before I even wrote anything, I heard a loud snap, as if something had fallen into the attic. My first reaction was to cover my mouth with my hand, so as not to scream. I looked at the hallway door and had the feeling that, at any moment, it could open by itself. Around 4 in the morning, the noise stopped completely. I stayed awake until the sun rose, sitting in bed, without the courage to close my eyes. When I finally created the strength to leave the room and look at the ceiling again, I realized that the attic door was covered by more dust, as if nothing had happened. No sign that it had been stirred, no clue other than the memories of the whole night. To this day, I avoid walking down the hallway at night. I never heard footsteps in the attic again, but the feeling that someone was up there continues to torment me. I always wonder, what if someone really managed to get in and out of that space without being seen? The most disturbing thing is that, even without an access ladder, the feeling I had was that someone knew exactly where it was, and stopped at the exact moment it was above my room. To this day I can't explain. So would you have the courage to open that attic door alone, at dawn, knowing that you heard footsteps inside? Story 8. I was coming home that night after a meeting that lasted longer than I should. The rain gave no respite, hitting hard against the windshield and forcing the wipers to work at maximum. It was late, almost midnight, and that stretch of the road was always not very busy, especially when the weather was bad. The only lighting came from the headlights of my car reflecting on the soaked asphalt, and sometimes I felt like I was driving through an endless tunnel of darkness and water. That's when something strange happened. Suddenly, in the middle of the road, the silhouette of a man appeared. He was completely soaked, desperately waving his arms as if he needed urgent help. My heart raced, and instinctively I froze, almost losing control because of the slippery track. All I could think about at that moment was that maybe an accident had happened, and that he was asking for help. The car stopped a few meters away from him, and for a few seconds I just stared. He looked exhausted, with dark clothes glued to his body by the rain. There was no vehicle nearby, no emergency light, no indication that something had happened beyond his presence. I hesitated to open the window or get out of the car, because something didn't fit. Still, I stood still, trying to understand. The rain drowned out all the sounds, and that's why the silence around was strange. No other car passed, no headlights in the distance, just me and that figure in the middle of the road. I took a deep breath, decided to trigger the flasher, and lowered the glass a little to ask if he needed help. It was at that moment that something happened that froze me all over. When I turned my face again towards the man, he was simply no longer there. There was no time to run, there was no noticeable movement, he had simply disappeared. All that was left were some marks of fresh mud on the asphalt, blurred by the rainwater that fell nonstop. My stomach turned, and for a few seconds I didn't know what to do. I looked everywhere, trying to locate any sign of him. I turned off the headlights for a few seconds and turned them on again, thinking that maybe the light had deceived me. But there was nothing but the wet road and darkness. It was as if I had imagined everything, but the marks on the floor proved that someone was there. An uncomfortable feeling took over me. I squeezed the steering wheel hard, wondering if I should get out of the car to check better. But something inside me told me not to do that. I was sure that if I left, something would go wrong. So, I decided to move on, still with my heart racing and breathing heavy. In the following minutes, I stared at the mirrors, afraid to see that figure behind the car, walking down the road, or even in the back seat. The tension was so great that my hands began to sweat, and I barely noticed the rain soaking everything around. The road seemed longer than ever, as if I would never get home. Even accelerating, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. At a certain moment, I swear I saw a figure on the side of the road, following the speed of the car. I don't know if it was the effect of the rain or my already tired mind, but it was enough to make me panic. I turned on the radio, just to have some sound besides the noise of the rain. When I finally arrived in a brighter area, near a gas station, I slowed down and stopped to breathe. I got out of the car for a few minutes, even with the rain, just to confirm that I was alone. I checked the back seat, checked the trunk, and nothing. Just me and that chill in my spine that didn't seem to go away. To this day, I try to understand what happened on that road. I've never passed by there again without accelerating as much as possible. Whenever I see someone asking for help on the road, I think twice before stopping. Maybe it was just someone real who disappeared in the middle of the darkness. But how to explain the marks that appeared and disappeared so quickly? That night made me rethink a lot of things. If it were you, would you have stopped the car when you saw someone waving in the middle of the deserted road, under rain, or would you have accelerated without looking back? Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.